All right, folks, let's settle down and listen to a podcast. My name is David Parsons, and this podcast is called Nostalgia Trap. Thank you so much for tuning into the program. I hope you enjoy this conversation. We're talking about college today, a subject near and dear to my heart, something that I've invested my entire adult life in going to college and teaching college and thinking about it as a valuable place, a place where students and faculty can transmit and share ideas that change their lives and change the world. That's the best vision I have of what college can be. But it's also anyone who's associated with college as a student, as a faculty member, even as an administrator knows that, there's been a crisis in higher education for many, many years. And a lot of that romance and feeling of changing the world and changing the lives of the people here has gone out the door, and instead we get an institution that's just as gross and as much of a ripoff as everything else in American society. And that part has been really, really depressing. And I've cataloged many times my own experiences as a part-time college teacher and all the humiliations that come with that. But there's also just the larger philosophical idea of, like, what are we doing with higher education beyond my own employment woes? What are we giving to students? What are students doing this for, and what are they getting out of it? And more, I'm asking myself, what do I tell students in class about what we're doing? How do I really narrativize what our activities are in the classroom and what their value might be? That's been a challenge, and that's something that I think a lot about. And my guest today is someone who has also thought a lot about this and written about it too. And I wanted to talk with him, and so that's why we have him on the show today. His name is Ryan Boyd. He is a professor in the writing program at the University of Southern California, and he has a great website, ryanaboyd.com, that collects a lot of his writing on teaching, on pedagogy, on the state of higher education in this neoliberal moment, in this COVID moment. And so I just wanted to get him in the Zoom room with me and lay out all my bitterness. I hope that this conversation was productive, because for me, being able to exchange ideas about the direction of things among different levels of faculty and administrators and students is really, really vital, because it's rare that you get the opportunity to kind of step back and ask, like, what the fuck are we doing here? And that's what I wanted to do with Ryan. So he has a lot to say about that, and I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you enjoy it as well. Let us know what you think. And check out our Patreon. I know I bug you guys about the Patreon all the time, and I know it's another one of those, like, things that you have to, like, go sign up for and get an account and put your email address and then get the email and put the code in. I know it's all bullshit and it sucks and it's one more thing. But the Patreon is, like, really vital to me, especially as a precariously employed academic. More and more, the podcast is a place that I consider my job. It's a place where I do the work that really connects to the things I study, the things I want to communicate to the wider public, and ideas that I think are valuable. So if you think that's valuable, please think about supporting the show. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. I think, honestly, we have some of the best bonus content in the left podcast business. You get tons of stuff. Seriously, like $5 will give you access to about 8 years of archives, episodes, video lectures, all sorts of cool stuff with all sorts of people like Justin Rogers Cooper, Yasmin Nair, KJ Shepard. All of our favorites on Nostalgia Trap are there on the Patreon. So go check that out. I'll stop bugging you about it, I promise. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. All right, let's talk about college and what the fuck we're all doing with Ryan Boyd. All right, well, Ryan Boyd, thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
You've been a consistent voice on Twitter for me, tracking this sort of battered but hopeful soul of a lot of people in higher education over the course of the last few years. But I wanted to maybe start by reading a piece that's not something you wrote on Twitter, but in the LA Review of Books, right at the beginning of the whole pandemic moment in, I think, May of 2020. I just wanted to read this quick introduction because it actually has a shout out to Kevin Gannon, who is a friend of the podcast and someone who's thinking a lot about this kind of stuff too. So let me just read this really quickly. This is from Ryan Boyd. It says, "For a while, it has been difficult to be optimistic about American higher education beyond the fortunes of a shrinking circle of elite schools. Just ask historian and professor Kevin Gannon, who introduces Radical Hope, a teaching manifesto, by claiming, and I mean this is literally the first sentence, that it has never been more difficult to teach in higher education than in our current moment. And thanks to strangulation by neoliberal austerity budgets, things are wretched for students too. It has also never been more difficult to learn in higher education than in our current moment. Nonetheless, the former group is still expected to be intellectually transformative, the latter transformed by and grateful for their collegiate experience. In a tottering empire's declining institutions, where corporate ideology and standardized tests and student loans and vast battalions of adjuncts dominate reality, it's hard to teach and learn." So that's Ryan Boyd in the LA Review of Books. I will link that piece in the episode description. But thanks for writing that, first of all, because I think it puts together, it articulates a lot of what a lot of us are feeling in this weird moment where it was sort of like it was already bad, and COVID seemed to, like, I don't know, bring out a lot of the worst elements. How is it for you right now?
Well, I mean, I always think that the position I occupy in higher ed, I teach at the University of Southern California, which is a wealthy private research university. To some extent, my colleagues and I in the writing program where I teach have been sheltered somewhat from the storms brought on by the pandemic. It's much more dire at a lot of public institutions, at city colleges, at schools that are less well funded. But yeah, I think you mentioned that this has been going on for a while, and COVID was kind of like this corrosive substance that came along and exposed all the weak points in a system that had been hollowed out really since the neoliberal turn of the 1970s and 80s. There's a scholar I know from UC Santa Barbara, Christopher Newfield, who wrote a book called The Great Mistake, which is about how public higher ed was basically defunded and wrecked by Reaganomics and 90s austerity politics. So it's gotten worse. Higher ed's lost a lot of its workforce. I mean, 10% of the workforce has disappeared during the pandemic. The number of students enrolled is going down. A lot of students seem to be sitting out right now. The college debt bubble keeps growing, and despite the president's campaign promises, there's no relief coming, it seems like. So things, I'm grateful for where I am kind of institutionally, but by no means am I under any illusions about being safe from the outside world, because there's no wall between academia and the real world.
Right. It seems like that's part of the problem, actually, is like when you talk, when you use the words like, I don't know, the neoliberal turn in higher education, I feel like that's what you're talking about. It's sort of like, I think I've mentioned this on the show before, the idea that I don't know, I went to graduate school in part because I fooled myself, and maybe I was naive, but I fooled myself into thinking that the academy was apart from everything else, was a place where I was not subjected to the sort of awful corporate atmosphere that I encountered in all those terrible office jobs that I took after college. I just wanted to go back to college because I felt like that was an escape from that, and it feels like the neoliberal turn is sort of the corporatization of the American universities. Again, maybe I was fooling myself. I wonder what you think about that, because part of what you write about is that there are a lot of romantic notions invested in teaching and learning. Is that good for us or not? Because part of me is always sort of conflicted about that part of academia. Like, are we separate or not?
Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of the same kind of romantic impulses you did when I went to grad school. I mean, I had great teachers in college, wonderful mentors at a public college I went to in the early 2000s, who really shaped me. And I wanted to have the kind of life they did. It seemed really cool to sit around and talk about books and writing and work with interesting people. And, like you, I thought, okay, higher ed, the ivory tower, that's, if not totally sequestered, it's different than, the office job or whatever. And, what I very quickly found when I got to graduate school in the University of California system at UC Santa Barbara in 2005 was that there was no split between the ivory tower and the, call it whatever, the corporate world. Universities are very much, managed and administered by the same sort of technocratic class that runs a lot of corporations. That is very focused on things like financialization and real estate and revenue. I always think I throw around words like higher education, just like everyone else. And I always wonder, what does that even mean? Mm-hmm. Higher than what,
right.
What does it mean to say okay, there's a thing like an ivory tower, right? I tend to think universities are those magical humanist projects like classrooms and good lectures and, science labs and research and art galleries, but it's also the real estate holdings and the campus police force and the McKinsey consultants who do enrollment management and, things like that, mm-hmm. lawyers who were brought on to stop labor unions that, that happens all across the country. These are very much institutions that are like a lot of other necrotic American institutions, for a long time now. So yeah, it was hard not to get cynical while I was going through this because, austerity budgeting had, really hurt the UC system. There were a lot of labor fights, we had to fight to get healthcare as grad students.
When were you at UC Santa Barbara?
I got there in the fall of 2005 and I finished my PhD in 2012.
Okay.
And then I taught for 2 years in their writing program as an adjunct before I worked a couple other jobs and then ended up down here at SC.
So yeah, when I think of UC Santa Barbara, that was entirely my undergrad experience. I was there between 96 and 2000 during the absolute height of third wave ska. So I saw Real Big Fish, the Aquabats, many other of those Southern California ska bands. And that's what I remember about that time. And I bring that up in part to say I was sort of dopey student going to that school. And I feel like students were, and maybe this was just me, but maybe not, like students are sort of shielded from all those kind of corporate elements that you're talking about. But there are cracks in that. And part of it was I saw a few different major labor fights happen among adjuncts at UCSB in the late 90s that made me aware of the entire idea that labor was being exploited at the school and that my teachers were not particularly happy about their situation. But then the other part of it was at the end of, I remember at the end of my 4 years when I graduated, I didn't know what I was going to do. And I thought, well, maybe I could work at the school. And I had this naive idea that I could just apply to these administrative jobs. And just because I was a student at the school, I'd get a job at the admissions desk or something like that. And I realized that I was entering into this other stage of the school, this other area of the school that was really dense in administrative bureaucracy and all the sort of financial elements that you're describing. And it was a different view of the school. And I feel like students now are maybe less shielded from those elements than before. I don't know if you agree with that.
I do. I think, universities work really hard to make sure their students don't hear about things like how much do your teachers make? Are your teachers adjuncts? Right. Is there unionization among the grad students? Et cetera, et cetera. Like we saw at Columbia recently, mm-hmm. In that battle between grad workers and the school, and they won, through their their numbers and their determination. But I think a lot of students are, if only because of things like student debt and the cost mm-hmm. of college, aware that this isn't like an enchanted place where you go and you're apart from the real world for 4 years. I mean, maybe that's that way if you're really wealthy or something. But I certainly wasn't. I always had costs looking over my shoulders when I was in school, especially when I got to grad school and I had to take out loans.
Things were cheaper then too. Isla Vista. I lived in Isla Vista, and my first apartment, my rent was $250 a month.
Oh my God!
To split a place with a couple other dudes, and it was easy in a different way than it is now. I think,
and they have a terrible housing crisis now.
Right. the golden 90s, the last moment for that kind of thing. I wonder, I mean, how much do you talk to students about working conditions, and how much is that a part of? Because I've struggled with that. Like, part of me is like, do I want to sit up here like in my syllabus, right, and tell you all about my struggles with employment and with the university and contingent academic labor and all that? Do I want to explain that to all my students? I have had conversations with students about that, but I wonder what you think about that, because I feel like it's kind of tricky territory.
Yeah, because, I teach writing classes, and, we have a lot of stuff that we have to do, work on, like, how do you craft a thesis statement? What does a conclusion look like? How do you do research and incorporate that, and, things like that. And I don't want, like you said, like, I don't want to take up too much of the oxygen by talking about, like, well, my working conditions, my struggles as a teacher. But I work it in kind of subtly. Like, I'll have sometimes, like, if we do a reading about, like, work in the United States. I'm developing a class on work right now, and we might read something about how the higher education world has been kind of gigified and adjunctified, and that might lead to conversations. But I don't sit there and, like, italicize myself as I'm this suffering figure. But I've had a lot of conversations with students about it, and I found that students who are familiar with, like, students who don't come from affluent backgrounds are really familiar with the way that people work hard and don't make enough money. And that happens even, like, for professionals, like college professors, a lot of the time. So, it depends on, a lot of it's, how insulated have students been by their experience, in this country or wherever they grew up.
Right. What about the concept of the hustle and how students respond to that? Because I also struggle with that idea. Like, because part of my whole academic career, my whole career in general has been a hustle. I have, like, a podcast. I have a million adjunct gigs always, or sometimes very few adjunct gigs. And it's just, it feels like there's a common thread with my students often, where they're entering into a world where they have, like, multiple jobs and that sort of thing. And I wonder how much that's a part of the discussion too, is sort of like the gig economy as a reality, and whether or not, like, the hustle is the right response to it. Because part of me is just like, Jesus, we're just being, like, poured into this hustle idea. And when I see credit card ads on TV that are like, what's your hustle? I'm like, Jesus, dude, like, this is just, like, more sort of Puritan work ethic.
Work till you die.
Century. Right.
Yeah. And, one of the things that gets talked about in a lot of, like, popular media now is the kind of mental health crisis that Gen Z is going through, with really high rates of anxiety and depression and suicide, et cetera. And I think what doesn't get talked about as much, people will talk about, like, well, is it social media or whatever? But I think a lot of it for, like, college students is the stress of being expected to be perfect to then get a good job that allows you to pay off your debt or buy a house. And, that you're probably not going to have a career where you stay in one place for a long time. And they're kind of, in a lot of ways, it's weird. Like, many students have bought into that kind of hustle culture, but they're also, like, sickened and exhausted by it, and they're aware of it. I think more aware than a lot of, like, old guys like us assume. They're in this stuff too, just like we are.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. There is an exhaustion with it. At the same time, you're kind of like, what are you going to do about it? That's how I've approached adjuncting.
Yeah.
So I guess they would approach it the same way.
Yeah, and there's a really good book that it was actually written by 3 scholars at USC called The Gig Academy.
Yeah,
that came out. I think, you're probably familiar with it. It's really, really interesting book, because it looks at how, higher ed as a sector has since the 70s has been a model for that kind of, temp work structure, use contractors as opposed to full-time labor forces, fight labor wherever you can, chisel wherever you can, and that runs counter to that mythos of, like, the enchanted ivory tower where you go and you read Shakespeare for 4 years.
Where does that happen?
Yeah, exactly.
Private universities, I guess, maybe.
Yeah, and at a school like where I am, it's we're a private university. in Los Angeles. So we are in many ways a kind of, green zone.
Yeah.
A lot of capital and cultural influence, flows through this place. But that leads to all sorts of really intense discussions and arguments that I think a lot of times universities duck about things like, are we gentrifying neighborhoods? When Columbia or USC or Chicago buys up real estate, puts up a shopping center. Like we've got the University Village on our campus, which is a huge shopping complex that went up where there used to be an older shopping center, and rents are going up. And there's, concern from surrounding communities about, heavy policing because of the university's presence. And, all of this stuff just, I hate to harp on this, but it comes back to this idea. And, I know, know this, that higher education is not like this pure, beneficent contributor to society. There are a lot of things we do as a sector that are really problematic.
Well, I mean, I worked at NYU for a while.
Yeah.
Which is, they're like a fucking global empire. And
they're in like Abu Dhabi now, aren't they?
Yeah. And I mean, they got a lot of attention when they built that university with slave labor over there. And, you tend to get attention, I guess, when you use slave labor. People tend to notice. But
it's bad PR.
Right. There's that part of it. But there was also that was just sort of the tip of the iceberg in terms of the entire enterprise. And that's part of what I wanted to get at, because it's sort of like, you say, like, what is higher education? What makes it higher? What are we doing? I feel like, the COVID moment and being online has really made me think about that harder than ever before. Sort of, what am I doing, particularly with students? What is the point of our class? And it's something that I think hard about, because I want to communicate a point to the students, if that makes sense. I want them to understand the value of what we're doing together. And that part of it becomes harder and harder to articulate, particularly when I think even students aren't sure what they're doing there in terms of like, I'm educating myself, but like heading towards a job. And it feels like when we're talking about like the neoliberal turn in the university, part of it is this like expectation of what school does for you, that like you get a degree and it leads to a job and that's what it is. When that's a turn even from like previous conceptions of what quote unquote higher education was. I wonder how you think about all that stuff, because it's tricky to navigate for me. It doesn't intersect with all those like romantic notions of like teaching versus like, I don't know, training.
Yeah, I think like, the dominant conception of higher ed now, whether you're talking about, a 2-year college or a 4-year school, a non-selective school or a quote unquote elite school. The idea is that it's job training, it's prep for you to be a, productive economic subject in the world. And the way that I think of it is that there's this kind of like, ideal humanist project of education. And then there's the, economic and political realities of these institutions. And, there's the dialectic, right? The way that I articulate it to my students in writing classes is that what I'm aiming to help you do is be able to be self-aware and critical of the world in an articulate way that sort of responds to complexities and doesn't buy into, slogans and simple thinking. And it sort of allows you to deal with the complexity of reality in a way that will, one, make your life a little bit less painful, hopefully, but also, prepare you to be, to have a job, but also to, make you somebody who is just more alive to the world. And, do we always accomplish that? Like, no. Do we most of the time? I don't know. That's one of the frustrating things about teaching, right? Is you don't have like a product at the end of the semester, right? You might enter grades into a grade book or, return papers or exams or whatever, but like, it's not like you're putting out like an edition of a magazine or like, even like, a podcast episode or something. There's not like a product at the end. And sometimes you get students, emailing you years later saying like, hey, I liked your class. Here's what I'm doing now. And that's always really gratifying. But I wonder how many of those students there are. And if a lot of this like, sort of humanist project gets lost in the churn of just like job prep, college debt, do academics, but have an amazing social life too, and have a job or an internship or whatever. Yeah.
It makes you've written about this sort of beyond the romance, the kind of ego of the academic as well, which is sort of like, I don't know, the idea that you're special in some way or something. And when I think about it, not all of us responded to the undergrad college experience the same way. Like, not everyone was so enamored by academia to the point where they're like, well, I'm going to go back and I'm going to like go a lot. In fact, I think most of the people I went to school with, including people I remained friends with, they were sort of like, no way. I'm done with school and books and learning, and no more of that for me. I want to go, do something else with my life. But for me, and I think for, I guess, you as well and others, there's like this contingent of people who are like really into it and think they're like see value in it and want to continue. And I wonder like what element that is, because it seems like there is part of it that thinks, well, I'm going to become that star academic. I'm going to become that person. I feel like maybe that's going to be less and less. There are fewer star academics out there, as more and more people know that entering into becoming a professor is much more like a job than a sort of like celebrity thing.
Yeah, or a calling or whatever.
Yeah, right. But it's still there, I feel like.
Yeah, I think there is, a tendency among academics to sort of assume that, well, I know something that other people don't, and I have a certain perspective on the world because of my training and my education. And I think, one way that plays out is that a lot of professors don't see themselves as like workers who sell their labor for a wage to an institution or an employer, but as like free agent consultants, kind of knowledge workers who aren't, necessarily like tied down the way
that hurts us, man.
Yeah.
The romance hurts us because it feels like when you think about, outside of higher education, think about like public high school teachers or public elementary school teachers, how like, we've witnessed our entire lives, decades now, of like right-wing attacks on teachers, seeing them as sort of exactly that, like volunteers, like people who are just like kind of there. They're not people that like deserve high wages or benefits or any of those. They're people who are sort of stealing, and they're like what those that cannot do teach. Which I heard a lot when I was young, and I'm realizing where did that come from? Where did that idea come from? Because it feels like it's a really ugly one, but a really pervasive one, and it connects to that romantic notion of teaching in some way. I feel like that romance almost undermines it because it isn't a job, a quote unquote, in a lot of people's minds.
Yeah, it plays into, the hands of managers and employers to say like, I love my job so much that I don't need a paycheck that allows me to like, own a house or have children or something. And they can sort of do the thing that happens to K through 12 teachers too. The idea that, well, it's like David Graeber says, it's almost like we get pissed off as a society at people who do important social reproductive work and are like, you get to do this important work. Why would you want pay too? Pay is for the people who are corporate lawyers and have to suffer that, right? And
pay is in the smile of all your students.
Exactly. And I think, in a lot of ways, if you love this job, and I think you kind of have to a certain extent, like it is a calling, but it's a huge mistake to forget that we're workers and that, you look at K through 12 teachers, they're much more heavily unionized than, for all the attacks on unions for the past 40 years, than faculty are. And there are faculty unions at, a lot of schools, but a lot of places, especially in the private sector, aren't unionized. And that's, I think we're seeing all this labor action, especially from graduate students at places like Santa Cruz and at Columbia and Michigan and elsewhere. I hope that creates pressure kind of upward and makes more faculty think about like, what are we as a labor force? What are our interests here collectively? Are we all just little, intellectual monads bouncing around the universe, creating our research or whatever?
Yeah. For me, it's like, I don't know how this happens, but sort of articulating our value to the public is something that needs to happen too, because it feels like, I don't know, when you say the words like grad student to the ordinary American, they have a very particular like ponytail stereotype in their head of like a worthless person that doesn't contribute to society and is kind of like jerking off in grad school somewhere, right?
Yeah, there's the Simpsons joke about it, right? Yeah, I'm a graduate student. I made $18,000 last year or whatever.
Right. Yeah, right. Yeah. And he's wagging, like Bart's wagging the ponytail.
The fake ponytail.
Yeah, totally. I remember that. And it's brutal because part of me is like, oh, Like, is that true? Is that what I did? Like, I like escaped the private sector and went into this place where I was sort of like apart from everybody, and that part of it, I think, is a big part of what we're talking about. That sort of feeling of separateness, and that public idea that we're not really priorities when it comes to I don't know, wages and benefits and those sorts of things. I mean, I don't know if you saw this like yesterday. Was it yesterday? Like Princeton graduate students got like $45,000 a year.
Yeah.
And like the reaction from like lefties online and other like I don't know, people I consider like left academics were like, $45,000 a year for graduate students. Like, what do they do for that? What do they do to deserve that? And I thought, like, wow, like even they are, because I think that, people hear the word Princeton graduate student and they're like, fuck those people. I don't care about them. And they get 45,000. Why should they get 45,000? What the fuck do they do? And I feel like that's a very difficult cultural thing to overcome.
Yeah, and it plays right into capital's hands to have us all, fighting like crabs in a barrel and saying like, not we all make too little, but you make too much, and that's not fair, and I'm going to get mad at you on Twitter or whatever.
Yep.
And I think like, it's great that they're getting this bump in their stipends, and I think like everyone should get that kind of a bump, and that's kind of the fight that we're in. And I wonder like if academics are up for that fight, because we haven't done very well for 40 years. I mean, we've kind of been fighting rearguard actions in a lot of ways.
$45,000 is not very not very much. First of all, in today's
in
world
New Jersey,
at all,
especially, right?
But also, I was thinking like because the common thing I saw was that people were saying, well, these people, this is just like a giveaway. It sounds like welfare to people. This was like Reagan era type type politics, where it was like, well, they're just getting $45,000 for doing nothing. But I thought, aren't they doing work? Like, isn't this an exchange for like a lot of labor?
Yeah. And one of the things that pisses me off about seeing, professors online getting mad at grad students who get paid more is that, these people are like, you used to be a grad student and they're the future supposedly of the profession. Why would you shit on people who are, supposedly climbing the ladder after you? And I think there's this impulse, I think a lot of senior academics have, to ignore the concerns of junior faculty. I think, a lot of senior tenured people don't realize how burned out and furious a lot of junior faculty are. I think there's a real disconnect there.
Yeah.
Sometimes like, we have a really good AAUP chapter at SC that brings together tenured and non-tenured people, but a lot of places those groups never talk to each other.
Oh yeah.
And the tenured minorities often sees itself as, more important or worthy or whatever than the filthy adjuncts teaching the comp classes or whatever.
Right. Yeah, that divide has been my whole career, dude. I mean, I worked at City University of New York, CUNY, as an adjunct for years at a number of their schools, and it was invisible, like as an adjunct, like totally invisible. And you talk about like an office, like some of these offices, I remember taking pictures of them and posting them online because I was like, dude, like look at this office for professors. It was like you had to share it with like 15 other people basically, and it was just like I don't know. It was like the worst dorm situation in terms of what a mess that room was, but also just I mean it kind of reinforced this idea that like we don't matter, and all that, and that part of it is I don't know. I'm not sure where things are headed right now, and that's part of what I wanted to talk about with you is sort of how things are going with the Zoom University. Because it's to me, like, I don't know if this tracks with you. Like, it feels like at the beginning of the pandemic, schools were sort of panicking about losing in-person classes. And we're sort of like, oh, shit. Like, we got to go back in person or else we're fucked here and our business model is gone. That business model being totally dependent upon enrollment and tuition. So there's a sort of idea that, like, the school has to sell itself. And in-person classes are how they're going to sell the school. But it seems like student demand has been for online classes, and schools are all of a sudden like sort of like caught in this switch where they're thinking, well, now we got to offer a lot of online classes because students don't necessarily want to come back in person. Has that been your experience at SC, and what's going on with the sort of wider shift? Because it feels like the demand is different than what schools expected.
Well, at SC, I'm teaching primarily, 18 to 22-year-olds who are living on a residential campus or just off campus, right? The kind of, in the American imagination, the platonic ideal of a college student. But, the average college student is, I think, like in their late 20s and not on a 4-year residential campus. They're going to, a local state school or a city college or a community college. They're going to, CUNY or the LA City College, places like that. And I think, for students at SC, there's more demand to just be back in person. But I can see why students who might have jobs or families would be way more interested in the flexibility of online education. Yeah. And then that raises questions about how high quality can it be? Do we end up with a situation where wealthy people pay a fortune to have their kids sit around a table in person, and then everyone else gets Zoom or whatever, or I'm sure you remember 10 years ago when MOOCs were going to be the massive open online courses were going to be the future of education, and what were the companies? They had silly Elon Musk names like edX and stuff.
Schools are really pushing that and saying this is going to be the future. And I was saying online education is going to destroy. And I was really pro in-person education at that moment, because I saw what they were trying to do. But it seems like schools sort of reversed themselves during the pandemic and no MOOCs. But MOOCs are sort of didn't work. It feels like that technology kind of went away. No one talks about MOOCs anymore.
No, I mean the data on them was that nobody really finished them unless they were already someone who was really invested in whatever the topic was. The completion rates were 10% for these courses.
I wonder how that compares to the completion rate for master classes that people take on YouTube with David Lynch and things like that. I really do wonder, because it feels like those kind of things, I don't know, you sign up for a master class with some celebrity. What do you do with that? It's entirely dependent on you, and it feels like the student that succeeds with online education is the person that's very, very self-motivated. Otherwise, you can just lose students. It feels like that's, for me at least.
Yeah, and retention is something that, rhetorically at least, universities worry about. And, I think teachers worry about it because we see the students, day-to-day basis. And we know people who are I can't afford college. I'm thinking of dropping out, or I'm thinking of transferring to someplace closer to home or whatever. If you look at across the board in the United States, a huge number of people who start off at college never finish, and they end up with things like student debt that they can't pay off, right? And end up kind of feeling almost, I would imagine, like they've been because they have been failed by these systems. So much of who gets through college depends on the level of affluence and material support you've had before college, right? Mm-hmm. The playing field is more level for some people than others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really apparent because I've been sort of a mercenary adjunct that teaches at a number of different. I guess I'm a Ronin. I guess that's what I am. Technically, that's the technical term.
You're a wandering warrior,
right? But I've taught at a whole bunch of different schools and at different levels of affluence, I guess you could say. So public schools and private. I've taught at NYU. I've taught courses at CUNY and at community colleges, and and even teach out at a military base, which is a whole other population, and relating to class and race and all that kinds of things.
I'm sure that was really interesting.
Oh, it's insane. Yeah, and I'm still teaching that population, but now we're online, so it's not quite the same. But either way, yeah, seeing how different people from different parts of the American sort of class stratification system fall into and experience college is super depressing, actually, because I taught at NYU, I taught at this school Emerson, which is the Boston Emerson, but it's in LA.
Yeah, it's right on Sunset, isn't it? Like near like Netflix and
Yes, it's
yeah,
an area of Sunset that it's called Silicon Beach, which is
that's right.
incredibly
That's right.
obnoxious. But
It's not close to the beach, first of all.
right. But it's Netflix, Hulu, Amazon. They're all there, and that's where all the students were going to intern because Emerson is. I mean, I think that those students are paying like $60,000 a year, and I thought to
Wow.
myself while I was there, like they had like access to. I mean, they had like major like Hollywood producers and screenwriters coming and guesting in the classes. They had access to equipment to make their own films that would look like, expensive Hollywood productions. And then like I drove after I would leave that school, I would then drive to Point Mugu Naval Air Force Base in near Oxnard, out in the fields, and teach a population who is so far from accessing all of those things at a military base is sort of like falling apart. I mean, I wish people could see some of the like classrooms that I've taught in over the years that are sort of like broken classrooms. But to come to a place where it was like there are cobwebs in the ceiling and it's just sort of like this falling apart classroom. The students are running around from 4 different jobs and hoping that the class wraps up quickly because they have to go home and like take care of their kids, etc. I mean, it was like 2 different worlds. And like that kind of code switching, I guess that's the like neoliberal term, is something that is hard not to notice when you're an adjunct because you like sort of see that experience is totally different. That's why it's sort of weird to like say anything general about higher education because it's such a vast, diverse experience for people.
Right, and so much of what you see the coverage of in legacy media is like what's happening at Yale Law School, or somebody got mad about food at Oberlin or whatever, and there's this focus on schools that end up near the top of the U.S. News ranking that and there's far more students have gone to city colleges than Harvard, right? Far more students go to Oklahoma State than to Yale, right? There are much larger populations of people who go to these, schools that are very good schools, for the most part, but don't have that sort of elite cachet. They don't send graduates to work at the New York Times like, Brown or, Amherst or whoever does.
There's not I feel like even when I think about academia in movies, it's in my head is like a vast lecture hall with like the dude with the tweed jacket. And they're still doing that. It feels like that model is still there. One of the only movies that like sort of covered this divide, that was a big Hollywood movie, is Good Will Hunting, that had like the 2 characters, like one teaches at a community college, the other one's teaching at Harvard or MIT maybe, and that was the only one that I can think of that at that level of Hollywood filmmaking that communicated that there were different experiences like that. Because I think Hollywood often tends to like say like it's either like people who went to college or people who didn't. When it's sort of like there's this this really big divide among people that actually did go to college in a class way. They're not all one monolithic group.
Yeah, I mean, you see this in stats like the lifetime earnings of Black college graduates are roughly in line with white people who just have a high school education, right? There's ways that, racialized stratification and class stratification come into the university and get produced by the university. And in a lot of ways, a university is an engine for conserving the status quo, even though it's got this, academia has this rep as being a place where like radical Maoists are teaching students to worship.
That's such an insane idea. There's the other angle is like the Fox News angle on what professors are like, which is always sort of like, I wish that were my experience actually.
Exactly. I mean, I think about like, somebody who's, for better or worse, very famous. I mean, a professor like Jordan Peterson, right? Famous for other things than being like a psychology professor, but, he kind of comes from that tenured security and has parlayed that into, ironically, a critique of, academia and it's
it is ironic,
quote unquote wokeness or whatever.
Yeah, because he's kind of a stereotype of that like egghead from previous eras that sort of like
who talks about myths and folklore and he's an intellectual and then he goes on Joe Rogan.
But there's something very, I think what part of what drives people crazy about him is there's something, I mean, for me, like watching him, I'm just like, there's something so performative about what he's doing. And it's exactly like what we're talking about here with like the ego and the romance of the, and the narcissism of the professor who's like, let me stroke my beard here and think very deeply and give you some like, some answer that is so convoluted that no one fucking understands what you just said. And that will come, and that's what is smart to people.
Yeah. I can't claim that this is, my observation, but I've heard it remarked that, people like Peterson are kind of the idea of a smart person, right? The idea of an intellectual.
Yeah.
And I think there's a very big difference between, quote unquote, public intellectuals like Peterson and then someone like, Mike Davis or, Django Yamada Taylor or someone like that. But, look who gets the airtime and, makes lots of money off of, he has like a Patreon or whatever now, I guess. And
who Jordan Peterson does?
Yeah, because he retired, in a huff and became an emeritus. And and I think about like, that kind of entrepreneurial academic spirit is something that is very much, neoliberal subjectivity, right? That we're all just like, entrepreneurs and intellectuals kind of working for ourselves. Maybe we're at a university for a while, but then we move on. And he's kind of the model of somebody who got rich doing that. And I wonder about that. I wonder about when we think, you were asking about like the kind of, wither higher education. And I wonder if there's this sort of thinking of ourselves as, important intellectual individuals is going to militate against things like collective labor action and, solidarity with other workers on campus. Because, I always think, in material terms, I have more in common with somebody who, does landscaping at the university than with like a president of a university. Yeah. Right. Most academics, that's true. We sell our labor for a wage, but we don't like to think of ourselves as working class. And it raises all sorts of, questions about, can you be an academic and say I'm working class? Is that stealing valor or something?
You have to hold a Budweiser can in your hand and sort of play. That is a really tricky question, and one that I think we've come to on the show before as almost like an impossible one, because it's like there's so many like kind of cultural separations between a professor, even an adjunct professor, and someone who like works as a cashier at Lowe's. You know what I mean? And yet at the same time, I have considered at certain points in my life, particularly when I first moved to California, I didn't have any adjunct work at all, going over and applying to be a cashier at Lowe's. And so like part of me is like, I come from working a lot of those types of jobs. Like when I first was working, I was always working at like restaurants and that sort of thing, and like working at like Joe jobs. And I always like, I went to graduate school in part because I wanted to kind of get away from that world. I didn't like that type of work, and I wanted to work somewhere else and something that felt meaningful to me. And for me, like that was academia. But then at the same time, I sort of like wrote myself away from the working class sort of world I was in before. I mean, it's weird to straddle those worlds, because it feels like there is a dividing line between those constituencies getting it together. I mean, that's a long story, I guess.
Yeah, I think about this with my own family. Neither of my parents went to college. I was a first generation college student. I have all the privilege of being a middle class white guy. But I went off to college kind of the same way you did. It's sort of like, I'm going to do something different than what my granddad did or what my dad does. And, those things are noble and great, but it's not for me. I want to read books and be an intellectual and all that. And that can be really useful as a life force, kind of keeping you alive, but it creates all of these like divisions and, disconnects. And, I wonder about if we need to build solidarity, are academics going to be part of that project, or are we going to hold ourselves apart in some way?
Yeah, we're snobs to people, honestly, for better or worse. I like to, I haven't done it since COVID, but I like to go to Las Vegas and try my hand with Lady Luck at the blackjack tables, and I'm always sitting with a bunch of just Americans, Vegas tourists and regular folk, and it often comes down to people asking like, well, what do you do? I rarely say professor, because I've said professor before and gotten the shittiest looks from people that just
Same.
absolutely just contempt, literal contempt. And I'm like, that's weird because it's like, like cops are always complaining that everybody fucking hates them. But it's like, dude, professors are hated people.
Yeah.
And like, that's a problem. It's beyond just kind of like, I mean, I should say some people, when they hear professor, they're like, wow, that's amazing. And they're kind of like, they sort of like want to know what you teach and what you research about and all things like that. But God, I think the baseline American is like, fuck you when you say you're a professor.
Yeah, and I often, when people ask me what I do, I say I teach college. I rarely say like I am a professor, because there are those, it sounds arrogant to say that. Two, it has all those like, connotations of, you're some, tweed wearing dickhead who thinks about like, Hegel or whatever all day and doesn't understand, whatever the average American is. And part of that is our fault, but a lot of it is also, years and years of, Nixonian and Reagan-esque propaganda saying
totally
like, those eggheads in the ivory tower who are, look at, in the 60s, a lot of radical faculty were, forming alliances with feminists and, civil rights activists and anti-war groups. And it made sense to say like, they're not like real Americans. They inhabit the ivory tower and they're indoctrinating our children into Marxism or whatever. And, you and I working in this know that that's not how universities work. Universities are engines for the status quo, as much as, a police department is, right?
Right. I mean, there's that other angle on it. That's like, there's another part of me throughout my entire career, especially working at like colleges that were like business centered colleges where I taught American history. So I'm like teaching these like, I don't know, Marxist points of view on American history, more or less, to a bunch of students that want to go work for Goldman Sachs. And there was a sort of idea that I was always trying to like, again, communicate the value of this to them. Like, you should know this. Even if you're going to go be a fucking stockbroker, you should know this. And here's why. But there's always the part of me that's like, I am training like neoliberal subjects. I am training people to go maintain the prisons and keep the matrix running, more or less. And I always, so there's the contradiction within myself, and I wonder if you identify with it, is that the other part of me is like, well, I got into this in part because I like the things that are like subverting the status quo, and I want students to be able to have exactly the sort of critical thinking skills that you're talking about, where they're able to survive in these neoliberal institutions because they're able to understand what's happening to them and maybe even steer the ship in a different direction, if that makes sense. And that's like, it seems like your impulses are always in conflict. In other words, I don't know if my goals as a teacher with the students aligns with like the institution's goals with the students. And that's, I guess, an age-old conflict.
Yeah, I mean, there's that real, tension in the university between, the humanist project of educating people to, what's the buzzword? Do critical thinking, right? We love critical thinking. Well, what if students start asking questions about like, how does the university overlap with, the police department in the city, or, in the real estate game, or, how much are workers at the school paid? Why does it cost so much to go here, right? There's a way in which critical thinking is dangerous if there's too much.
Why does NYU use slave labor?
Right. And, and I don't really know how to resolve that contradiction, because, we are in many ways complicit in a system that loads people down with debt, that reinforces class stratifications. We're soldiers in that project as professors. And yet at the same time, we're part of these sort of pockets of radical thought that can be, incubated by a university. And the question is, how do you like expand those and build power in an institution? So it's not just, consultants and spreadsheet guys running everything.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, is like, how do you sort of remain in the institution and transform it in some way? I mean, in my most sort of optimistic and utopian moments, I look at the universities as like having enormous potential to be transformative institutions, but they're not right now. And that part of it is that's part of why it's depressing, I think, to think about the state of things. At the same time, understand that I don't know, we're in like maybe the most like transformative moment I've lived through in higher education and the world in general it seems like when there is chaos like this, there's possibility for a lot of different directions. So it's hard to make any prediction about the direction of things, I guess.
Yeah. I often think back to something that Angela Davis said about, institutions. And she says, I'm paraphrasing here, that, institutions aren't in and of themselves a problem. It's that they're not responsive to democratic needs of everyone, right? And why not build institutions which are truly democratic and, are really part of a, social democracy as opposed to like, academic capitalism or neoliberalism or whatever. There's a scholar at Stanford named, I think, Emily Levine, who talks about the academic social contract, and how that's a very fraught term because that can mean things like university research serving the Defense Department, but it could also mean creating more self-aware, thoughtful, articulate citizens. So it's all these things happening.
Yeah, it makes me think of the free speech movement and the initial like student radicals at Berkeley in the early '60s, who before they were like throwing rocks about the Vietnam War, their main concern was the civil rights movement and racism, but also the university's ties to the military-industrial complex and nuclear research labs. And they were, those people like Mario Savio and others. I know you've probably seen that stuff. It's sort of like what they were really standing up for was a kind of romantic notion of the university and what purpose it served beyond just making them all cogs in the machine. They felt like it feels like a lot of that like C. Wright Mills like 60s stuff was expressing partly like exactly what we're expressing now, which is like, what is the university's purpose? Why are we here? And it's always like faculty and students versus the administration in terms of like the entire philosophical core of what's going on here. And that seems like a contradiction that, it's not been reconciled. Maybe it is the dialectic, and maybe that's taking place everywhere, not just in schools. But God, watching what's happening in schools now, not only universities, but K through 12 is to me like blowing my mind in terms of where things are going. Because it feels like there are people that are going to make the end run to say, well, this is like the end of public education, and it's going to be something that people pay for again. And I can easily see, I mean, when I think about neoliberal, what I really mean is like capitalist scumfucks wanting to bring us back to the 19th century. And that seems like with COVID, things could go either way.
Yeah. I think, back to that stat that said, in I think it was in 2020 or the 2020-2021 fiscal year, higher ed as a sector lost like a tenth of its workforce. And I remember thinking like, that's got to lead to something seismic happening. And it hasn't yet. We've seen these ruptures at places like, the Columbia grad workers strike, that have sort of popped off where, like you said, there's this students and faculty and workers kind of against the administration.
Right.
But I wonder, I was thinking, I know you wrote a book about GI coffee houses in Vietnam, right? And I think about like those GIs who are radicals in the military. I don't want to make a one-to-one comparison between higher ed and the military, right?
Right.
They're not the same thing, but that idea of being kind of an outsider or a radical inside of an institution, which is deeply, capitalist and conservative and all about conserving the imperial status quo.
Yeah. I totally agree. There are. It's not a one-to-one, but if there are any kind of opportunities to make common cause with my students that are in the U.S. military or are retiring from the U.S. military, it's the experience of like working for a big, immovable institution. And like, I mean, the people in the military really think a lot, especially the ones that that are in college, are people who are getting their college through the GI Bill. So they're very like aware of how benefits work. They're very aware of like getting their right amount in their paycheck each month. And they're people who are like, I don't know, concerned about a lot of the same things that I'm concerned with as an adjunct, if that makes sense. Of like getting ripped off and knowing that they're going to get ripped off by these big institutions. So to me, it's like that. There's the common cause with like me being a quote unquote professor that's in the ivory tower and coming down and understanding that being able to communicate that I'm not in an ivory tower, I guess, is part of that. And I don't know how exactly that happens, but the more working class professors kind of become, it seems like that's a unavoidable conversation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, you're seeing, the proletarianization of professoriate, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's what Marx and Engels talk about, right? It's the same thing that happens everywhere. Yeah, whoever those, I don't want to mention those names aloud. I think this experience of being tangled up in huge institutions, whether that's a corporation or a military or a university, is something that can unite people in struggle, right, against capital or management or the employer or the status quo, the man, whatever. But I think it's a very open question as to can higher ed nurture that critique, or is it just like we want a little creative thinking and a little bit of critical thinking, but not too much?
Yeah, I wonder about that too. Kind of like, the more conspiratorial mind, if I would turn into the Joe Rogan podcast really quickly, I'm like, wait a second. Like, higher education took all the radicals and like put them in graduate school where they do nothing, and where their critiques are written into little dissertations that are put on a shelf somewhere and no one ever looks at them. And like in my most like pessimistic and cynical moments, I feel that way. Again, it's like this notion of being sequestered and being like segregated from the rest of society feels like there are so many. I mean, as much as the Fox News vision of like, Marxist radicals taking over the university is bullshit. It's there are a lot of Marxist graduate students. Maybe that's the conditions produce the Marxism, maybe. But either way, it feels like there is a lot of radicalism and a lot of radical ideas that are sort of put in a place that that keeps those ideas apart from everybody else, and not only that, not only the ideas, but like the people who are disempowered.
Yeah, and I think this speaks to the value of sort of intellectual work and life that happens outside of university context. I mean, through magazines like Public Books, the New York Review of Books, or the Drift, or The Point, or whatever. It's through substantive podcasts. It's through stuff that sometimes gets called like para-academic or public intellectual or whatever. But I think like one thing that professors need to realize is that we don't have a monopoly on education, learning and
or ideas or reading books or anything else. Yeah,
exactly right. I had a professor in grad school who, one of his best friends was a guy he met when the guy who was an exterminator came to his house to deal with a mouse problem and noticed he had a bunch of Laura Riding books in his library and was like, oh, I love her poetry. And they became friends that way. And, it was this guy who was a professor and then an exterminator. And I remember thinking when I was younger, like, what an odd couple, right? There's a working class guy and a professor.
Right.
But then I realized, how kind of snobby that is to think, and how, professors don't have a monopoly on critical thought. But it would be terrible if we did.
And it can't be true either, because you're thinking like, well, we all know, and part of what we're talking about here is we all know there are like major economic barriers to everyone going to college, right? And so that means there are a lot of really, really smart people that are really engaged in being critical thinkers and doing reading on their own, et cetera, that never went to college. And just did it on their own. And I think, like, I don't know, you mentioned podcasts and that whole world, but it's part of a moment that I think is sort of revealing that, where you see more and more people who are having these advanced conversations on their podcast. None of them have degrees. They're just people who are like interested in this stuff. And that, to me, like, when I hear students or others or young people or even like the Joe Rogan set say like, well, you don't need college anymore because you can just go on YouTube and teach yourself. Like, one part of me is like, well, yeah, I guess. But the other part of me is like, most people don't. That's not what colleges are, and that's not what colleges do. Is like watch YouTube videos, or there's a certain sort of pedagogy that happens in colleges that I would defend as more than the type of things that we call self-learning. I don't know how you feel about that, because it feels like in that environment of like, you can just take a master class with David Lynch on YouTube. Why do we need college? It means that college it is on us to sort of like articulate what the value of college is. And for me, it has to be beyond just, it'll get you a good job.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I mean, so often it doesn't get you a good job anymore, right?
Look at me, right?
Right. I mean, like that contract has been broken for a long time. And I think that's part of the reason there's an opening for a lot of students to be radicalized by this. But yeah, I think like, we have to make a case for why we're more than just, okay, because it's like the question of like, okay, so much information is on the internet now, but you need frameworks for understanding it. And I think there's a value in college and going to a place and spending time in, interactive, collaborative spaces, thinking alongside like teachers who do know more than you because they're older and they've studied this stuff for a long time, and they can kind of help you create new knowledge and actualize yourself and all that good stuff. And that's how I try to sell it. And, when I talk to people about what I do, I don't emphasize like, the research I do is really important. I talk about like, well, it's teaching, it's helping people kind of be more alive.
Yeah.
And YouTube might do that for some people, but, for most people, like you said, that's not how it works. It never has. Right.
Well, we'll wrap it up here. I know we both got to go, but it feels like that that COVID, the last 2 years have been a test of that, right? In a lot of ways, because I don't know, you're doing in-person classes, right?
Right. We were in person in the fall. We were online for the first 2 weeks of this semester, and now we're back in person. Masking. We have a vax mandate and booster mandate. We're in a blue city, so it's not as dire as professors who teach in red states and who can't even ask their students to wear a mask. That's happened in places like the University of Georgia last semester. So it's again, it comes back to the kind of class stratification within higher education, right? There's a level of privilege in what I get to do and where I get to be. At the same time, a tenured professor might look at me and be like, "That's not a real professor. He's just teaching track."
Right.
But yeah, I think like all this stuff is important, and I guess like what we've been keep coming back to is this idea that we say higher ed, we say college or academia, and it is many, many overlapping things.
Yeah.
It's not one thing.
Yeah, you're right. And COVID feels like has sort of eliminated a lot of those barriers. Like more and more people are aware that college students have lives beyond college and are working and are involved in the sort of navigating the world of COVID that all of us are at work, at school, and with their families. And that part of it seems, I don't know, it opens up a conversation that maybe we need to have about what the fuck all of us are doing through all of this stuff. I'm still online, dude. Like I have not been in a classroom since March of 2020. And wow. I've, as semesters go on, and I'm starting one right now. It's like I'm thinking hard about like the online class as having value one way or the other. And there's an evolution to that. It feels like at the beginning I was sort of like very light touch, asynchronous, sort of like check-ins. I know everyone's busy and freaking out about getting COVID, so let's do like a minimal thing. But now I want to see the students. I want them to like be on camera with me. And like you and I have sat here for the last hour and like had a valuable conversation. And like to me, there are a lot of classes and class moments that I've had in these last 2 years that have been really great classes on Zoom, which I didn't really expect. And so now I'm looking forward to the metaverse.
Yeah, I mean, it was when we were in grad school, it was going to be Second Life, right? That was going to revolutionize this. And now we have the metaverse. Who knows? Maybe my avatar will be teaching classes at some point.
Hell yeah. And that avatar will be inseparable from you, like physically, like you'll be able to not tell the difference between yourself and the avatar.
Students can tip me in crypto through my crypto wallet, things like that.
Go ahead and throw a tip in my crypto wallet if you like today's presentation. Sometimes college feels that way. And it's funny, I teach these lifelong learning institutes too, which are connected to colleges, but they're for like older populations or retired. And they're different because they're just lectures. I just like lecture about pop music or the history of film or something like that. But there's much more of an impulse to like directly like come up with almost like clickbaity titles or titles that like sell and that people want to, because people just pay for these classes just like they're buying a ticket to a movie or something like that. And there's really a notion to just like make the poppiest sort of class that's going to bring people's attention. But what I've learned is that like people really have a desire to engage in ideas and learning and all that sort of stuff. And this population is like super fun to teach with. But it also is that like it's made me think about like what I'm actually doing, because I am sort of like creating things that like draw attention, if that makes sense, and like sell online. And that's like, I don't know, that's part of what teaching is too now, I guess.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, Ryan, thank you so much. I really appreciate talking with you.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much for having me.
And good luck with the semester and future semesters, whatever we're doing, whether we're online or otherwise.
Wherever this pandemic takes us, right?
That's right. All right. Thanks, Ryan.
All right. Take care.
Well, okay. I think that's going to do it for today. I want to thank my guest, Ryan Boyd. Go check out his website, ryanaboyd.com. In addition to all his stuff about pedagogy and the state of higher education, he's got some great poetry and creative writing on there. And check out his Twitter as well. He is a very, very funny guy on Twitter. So thanks, Ryan, for coming on the show. And thanks to everyone for listening to Nostalgia Trap and supporting the show. If you want to do that, I would really appreciate it. You can do it at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We'll see you again very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.